Welcome again to American Zarathustra. We are very, very pleased today to have a very special new guest, my new friend and a new and important voice on the scene in the white positive sphere, dissident right, alt-right, Hapa Perspective. How are you today, sir?
I'm doing great, surviving.
Yes, indeed, indeed. And also want to welcome back my friend and co-host, Gaius Nullis. How are you, sir?
I'm doing all right. Hello, Donald. Hello to Hapa Perspective, and hello to the audience.
Brilliant, brilliant. So for anybody who follows my YouTube, American Zarathustra, you can see an interview conversation with Hapa Perspective that's not under the Imperium Art playlist. It's simply just him and I talking. Hope to do more of these kind of non-art related conversations just because there's so much going on and so many interesting people out there to talk to. So that you can find that again on this channel, American Zarathustra Interviews, Hapa Perspective, Race is Culture, Individualism, Policy to Create a White Majority. So Hapa, it's just fantastic to be back again with you here. I want to tell the audience first that I first learned about you through Millennial Woes. You were also a guest on Millenniyule this 2020. And so it's just been really, really cool checking out your YouTube and getting acquainted with your perspectives. So I feel just excited to have you on the show. And I think you're going to bring a fresh voice to the Imperium Art project. So thanks so much for joining us.
Yeah, you're welcome. You're welcome.
Okay, so if you could introduce yourself a bit, talk a bit about your background, why you got into blogging, talking about white identity politics. Tell us about your appearance on Millennial Woes a bit. I'll leave it to you.
Where do I begin?
In the beginning, there was the word. No, that's too far back. Let's say maybe just kind of give us a profile of yourself.
Like how I got into the alt-right politics, or well, for me, it all started with watching the migrant crisis unfold in 2015. Before 2015, I was aware of some of this stuff, but it just didn't have any traction anywhere. So for me, what I saw was that the migrant crisis was really kind of the wake-up call, the system shock for a lot of white people and the online political community, we'll say, because that's when things you really started to see like a stronger left-right divide. At the time, I had an ex-girlfriend that was in Germany, and she was at these asylum centers. You can just imagine this pretty tall blonde girl.
Yeah.
And she was at these asylum centers, like handing them water bottles, and she posted about it on her Facebook.
Yeah.
And I was looking at pictures, and I saw her like helping out all these like black and brown men who were supposed to be Syrian migrants, but they clearly weren't. And it was all men, all military age men that were probably looking at her like a piece of meat, of course.
Right. Yeah, naturally.
And I tried to explain all of that to her, like, this doesn't look right. There's something that's not right about this. But I was kind of just being careful. I knew that she was more liberal, so I kind of just used more. I kind of implied that this is like an invasion. I didn't want to be too direct, but she still called me a racist anyway. So. Yeah. I'm just like, wow, we've got a big problem here. It's not just that Europe is being invaded, but also that a lot of Europeans are. I mean, a lot of Europeans are waking up, but not enough, not quickly enough. So, and that was around the time that I found Millennial Woes, because I was trying to understand the migrant crisis, and he was one of the few YouTubers that was really talking about it.
What year would you say that was?
2015.
Okay.
At the latest.
But you're fairly new to blogging, though, am I right?
Yeah, I'm fairly new to the content creation side of things,
Mm-hmm.
be it blogging or my YouTube channel or Telegram. I wasn't like communicating with the community really. I had a Twitter account in 2016 and 2017 that got suspended, and I just kind of stopped.
Well, you were doing something right if it got suspended. So
Yeah.
wow. So tell us more about your blog then. What? Because I'm looking at it right now. Hapa Perspective.home.blog. I'll be, of course, putting your link tree and everything in, under this interview. But here are just some of the titles. The world of firearms technology is racism. Knee deep in global homo hell. War without men. Our drone strikes the future of warfare. Critique of the lie that is community by Gonzo Lira. And of course, I follow you on Telegram, in which you have like a really rich and lively kind of news feed. So, and a pretty cool, audience there as well with some interesting insights. So yeah, it's kind of good to get to know you and see what you're bringing to the overall conversation. Could you tell us about your appearance on Millennial Woes?
I had alcohol in my system at the time, so I was really
You're not supposed to say
nervous.
that. Oh, okay.
I think I want to be open about it because I don't think my performance was very good. Because I just felt like I was under a lot of pressure because I'm such a Millennial Woes fanboy. He's the man, all right, and he's kind of like the kingpin of the community, and so I've been following him for so many years that finally I get to talk to him and I'm on his show. I mean, I've talked to him before, but on over a live stream with his whole audience, the pressure was on, and I kind of had some alcohol to cope. So I felt like I stuttered a lot, and I was really nervous, and I was kind of overcompensating for my nervousness by it's kind of like when I first talked to you, I kind of was. That's kind of how I deal with it. I talk more than I listen. So sorry about that.
No, it's fine. I mean, I guess we're all human at the end of the day.
Yeah.
I remember for me, it was my appearance on No White Guilt. That was a big breakthrough moment for me. And I don't like to admit that I was nervous. I just would say that I was really on my toes, put it that way, and
that's the better way of putting it.
Yeah. I just like talked like nonstop throughout however long it was, an hour or two, but it was rich. It was fun and cool. So what were some of the topics though that you covered on Millennial?
A lot of different things. A big thing that I expected and I wanted to talk about was the fact that I was mixed and what do I think about people being mixed. And someone in the audience brought up this guy from 19th century France named Alexander Dumas, and he was like this French guy that was a quarter African genetically. And Woes was saying, I wouldn't want to deport this guy, but clearly this person isn't white.
Okay.
Yeah, and he kind of had like he looked like he was a quarter African, and he had like a afro and everything. Oh. And so we talked about that, and the audience was kind of seething because apparently they don't like it that I like white women. That was a big issue. So, so I thought that was funny, but I fully expected that. I don't blame them, but yeah, I was kind of what are some other things? It was just fun, really. I wanted it to be, I wanted it to be entertaining. So he made a lot of jokes about Hapas and stuff, and that was fun. I like entertainment. I think things should be fun because he had a lot of people on there that were really serious. And the subject matter is serious. Everything that we discuss is serious, but there needs to be an entertainment factor. Mm-hmm. There were a lot of like spurgy autistic kind of people. I mean, I don't want to name names. I'm not trying to say anyone's performance was bad or anything, but some people were more enjoyable to listen to than others.
There you go. Yeah, it kind of depends, but I mean, I'm always like Dallas and I always kind of crack a joke here and there just to lighten it up and have a good time. But let's dive into the Hapa experience a bit more. I mean, this is something that I am very familiar with. My son is AmerAsian. You know, you and I have a certain connection in some ways here. But let me first get Nellis's perspective on the things we've talked about so far.
Yeah, I just wanted to, first of all, this is a great introduction to the conversation, and I really wanted to sort of circle back to 2015 because I believe that that's a very important watershed moment in history for us. And in my particular case, you could say I was raised nationalist. I was raised with a very strong awareness of my ethnic heritage. Both of my parents are Hungarian, so I was raised in a very Hungarian a nationalist, being proud of my heritage, being proud of my background, kind of way. So that was never an issue for me. But up until 2015, you know, I mean, of course, there were moments that were unique to the Hungarian experience. 2006 was a very big moment in for the Hungarian nationalists because there were big protests in Hungary against the left wing and neoliberal regime, but that's another topic altogether. Suffice it to say, up until 2015, I would argue that my position was very uniquely Hungarian oriented. It wasn't really this broader perspective of understanding the common struggle that we're facing. And 2015 was that moment where I kind of realized where this is, you know, we're all in it together, and we have to sort of broaden ourselves as well to include the brotherhood of the European man, if it were, you know, as it were. And so this is a very important point. I think a lot of the arguments I had before 2015, where, you know, there were more social issues or morality issues, you know, the gay marriage issue, you know, I was steadfast against it. And I was always surprised at how people that I grew up with, people that I knew, and people whose parents and backgrounds were similar to mine, you know, they all had these very warped ideas about these things. And then when the migrant crisis hit, that was where it really, you know, this great divide occurred where, you know, if you said the word migrant or invader, then people would get very offended by it. And they would say, no, they're refugees. And then there was this constant argument that they are not refugees. And then, of course, the big argument, like you accurately said, a lot of these guys were not even Syrian. I mean, you had a lot of guys from Sri Lanka that were there. And it's like, how the hell did they get to Europe? You know, like that was just a bizarre kind of thing. And so you see this invasion in 2015, and I think that there's several points, and you brought up these really important points. Number one is it woke up a lot of people, but number two, it also made us realize that even more people are completely brainwashed and don't even understand what's happening around them. So I think that this is a very important point in history, and I think this is something that we should sort of maybe even focus on at one time or sometime in the future, as far as exactly what happened in 2015, because it's very important. So I just wanted to add my personal experience to that. So I think that it was a very good thing that you brought this up.
Mm. Certainly a major time for many people, specifically people that are tuned into, you know, saving Western civilization, white identity politics, and these kinds of things. So, but to get back a little bit to the Hapa experience, I guess this is one of the central questions that I'm interested in, and I think the greater audience has something to learn from. So I wanted to ask you, what can the dissident right learn from the AmerAsian or Hapa experience on white identity politics? And I know you talk about this a bit on your YouTube.
I have a lot more to say about it. I've just scratched the surface on my YouTube channel. You know, the term, the phrase identity politics, it's, you know, that's under a lot of scrutiny because it's like, oh, that's what the left does. But it's almost redundant because all politics are identity politics.
Yeah. Yes.
So, I mean, what would politics be without identity?
Of course,
I mean,
it's the core of it. Dealing with people who deny that is super irritating. This notion that ideas are more, I don't know, real, I guess, than biology or something like that. And
exactly.
Yeah, so maybe you can kind of jump off in that point.
About identity politics or ideas being more real than biology.
Well, about the biology and I mean, maybe to start grounding it off with your experience, half white, half Chinese, and growing up in America.
Mm.
You've talked about white supremacy in your videos. You've talked about race mixing, optical nationalism. You have very much to say about the topic, and I think something I've talked about several times in my shows is this concept I have of a Western alliance with people who are mixed race or that are very strongly in defense of Western civilization. So I feel like this is a huge area that nobody's really talked about or covered in the Dissident Right.
Well, it's hard for people to cover it because they don't have experience with it. They don't, or I think a lot of these people don't have much to say about it because they live in areas where, like, they see what's going on in the world, but
Mhm.
they're not physically exposed to areas of the West that are non-white or, really diverse.
Mm.
Whereas I grew up in like a white majority neighborhood, but surrounding areas and family friends were very diverse. Very, I had a lot of non-white family friends growing up and family members, and even though it was a white majority neighborhood, my immediate neighbors were non-white. They were like the token non-whites in the neighborhood, and yeah, so it's just things like that. I saw these two different worlds, and they sort of. It seems like everybody has a sort of double consciousness on these subjects. There's a lot of double consciousness. I'll get into that later,
Yeah.
but like I had a black family living near me that they were living with us in this white majority neighborhood, but they couldn't let go of their black identity. They couldn't do it. They were well-to-do people and all of that. And the same thing could be said for the East Asian families living in this neighborhood, which, again, was majority white.
Mhm.
And a lot of things about the culture that even these non-white families subscribed to was Western on the surface.
Mm.
Right. And you see that a lot. And, it begs the question, what is culture?
Mhm. Mhm.
Because, some people in the CivNat, the CivNats like Lawrence Southern like to say, well, what is race? And my answer to them is, what is culture?
Right. Well,
So,
how would you answer that then?
well, when people normally speak of culture, their understanding of it is superficial. It's like what kind of clothes you wear, what kind of food you cook, what language you speak. Then people that are maybe a little bit smarter than that will say it's things like what you believe politically, like what legal system we should have. Culture could be things like gun rights, and so on and so on and so forth. But I think it gets a lot deeper than that, because if you really look beyond the superficial side of culture, you get into sensibilities. There are things about culture that can't easily be articulated, but you kind of know it when you see it.
Mm.
It's like it's how people see themselves, how they understand things like justice. So, like, for example, in America, there's a lot of division between blacks and whites, not just because, well on the surface. Well, how can I explain this? uh, we have we live we share we all live under one roof, all of these different races,
Sure.
right?
Sure. Sure.
Or when I say we, I mean all people that have American passports.
Yes. Okay. Right. Okay.
But we can't agree on what sort of the interpretation of just the law itself is like a matter of like huge division. Whenever like you saw with George Floyd, right?
Oh,
Like a white
yeah,
person looks at that and, oh, of course, well, George Floyd was high on fentanyl,
yeah,
and
yeah,
that's, but a black person doesn't see that. They see a white man or a white-ish looking Asian guy. I forget the race of, yeah, I think it was the white cop, because it was a
yeah,
multiracial group of cops that were trying to arrest George Floyd, but it
correct.
was the white cop that put his knee on George Floyd's neck. And just the optics of that alone racially divided the nation, or
Mhm.
the country. I shouldn't say nation. I should say country.
I understand your
Uh,
point. Yeah.
but and it's like when you see all of these videos of like cops trying to arrest black perpetrators, and they end up like having to shoot them or beat them up.
Yeah.
You know, white people see that and they understand, oh, well, this black person is resisting arrest, or they try not to see the fact that the perpetrator is black.
Yeah.
They just, oh, this person's resisting. Uh-oh, is there something wrong? Can you still hear me? Okay.
Yeah. Yeah. You're fine. You're good to
Okay.
go. Yeah.
So it's not just there's the optics of it, and the optics of these events that are always racialized because we live in a multiracial country. There's that aspect of it, but then there's also, I think that these other races living within our country have, because of their racial sensibilities, their racial psychology, they inherently want different laws. They want the state to behave a different way. They
Perhaps
they don't value. Sorry.
I'm sorry. I was just saying perhaps to reflect them and their culture and their kind of perspectives and sensibilities.
Well, it's better to think of it as sensibilities than culture,
Yeah, I
perhaps.
really think that's an interesting way to look at it, sensibilities, because with my experience as a former teacher working with people of color and sort of low income schooling situations, there's a extremely, even if my eyes were closed throughout the day, I would know who's who by their sensibilities, and I strongly
Yes, yeah.
attune to that. I know Nellis wanted to comment a little bit. Let's let him jump in.
Yeah, this is actually a really important part of this conversation. We have to, and I think our community has to be aware that this isn't a new phenomenon. This is a decades-old phenomenon,
Sure.
where you have a very percentage of the population in certain areas in the Western world that have been uh, maybe mixed a little bit more, you could say, than in other areas. So I've spent time in highly diverse areas. I've spent time in very homogenous areas, and even in my immediate community, I know people that have mixed race backgrounds, of various sorts. So this is definitely not a new thing. This is actually something that's been kind of slowly simmering for decades. And I think that what Hapa Perspective was talking about is very important, because a lot of people, and this may be also related to the immigrant experience, in particular to the United States, but I think that this experience could be translated anywhere. When you have a first generation immigrant coming into a host country, regardless of where it is, they're always going to identify with their home country culturally, and maybe even from a personal identity point of view. And it's going to take at least two, maybe three generations for full assimilation. Now, this is, let's just say, if it's a European that comes to the United States, so it's not even a racial issue. This is a cultural issue, first and foremost, because the food, the language, the customs, the traditions, these things gradually change over the generations. Now, a lot of times, you'll have people that also are, and I think that it's been successful, for example, in the United States for the most part, where within a few generations, when you have a European that came to the United States, within 2 or 3 generations, there was full assimilation. Now, you have a difficulty, because now you have a larger community coming over, and then they can then self-identify with each other within their own kind of in-group. And that leads them to sort of being in this kind of a half assimilation phase. You could even say it's an assimilation oblivion that they're living in, where they're kind of halfway here, halfway there, and it goes on from generation to generation because the in-group is so large that they can then continue this with each other. And you see that with a lot of different immigrant communities, also from Europe, that come here. I mean, I can speak from my own experience in that regard. I think that from the cultural perspective, that's one thing. But when you're looking at it, from a, how should I put it? From the racial perspective, it becomes more profound because, then you have more, not only a cultural distinction, but you also have that clear distinction of race that's obvious to everyone in the community. So that distinction is even more heightened. So how about I'm sorry, just I can stop at any time if you want to jump in.
Oh, I was going to say something about assimilation. This idea that half assimilation, I feel like these other groups haven't really assimilated at all. I mean,
Right.
African Americans have been here for hundreds of years. They haven't assimilated at all. They almost speak a different language.
Totally.
Yeah, well, that's
they've only assimilated if you not you, but like someone listening to this, if they might say, oh well, they've assimilated on some level if they have a sort of superficial understanding of culture. Oh, it's language and food, and you shop at Walmart too, right? That, like, what is culture? And to me, really, what culture is, it's just sort of the outward appearance, if you will, of sensibilities, established sensibilities that as you change the racial component, the racial demographics of a country, the sensibilities will change because sensibilities are downstream from race.
Interesting. Now, if you were to just even compare the sensibilities of the Germans to the Italians, you would see a difference.
There is a difference. My mother's from Philly. Yeah, and my parents are from that area, I'll just say.
Okay.
And I'm not going to say that Italians are not white, but they're clearly, their sensibilities are not Anglo-Saxon.
This is understood for sure.
And they've been here for 100 years almost, and that hasn't changed. It's changed a little bit because, they are white. So sure, like, for example, I'm sure many Italian Americans would support, let's say, certain facets of American culture, like the Second Amendment or something. But those sensibilities ultimately came from Anglo-Saxons. They didn't come from the Irish or the Italians or, even Germans. So that's an Anglo-Saxon thing. I'm half Anglo-Saxon, and that's where it originates from. And if heritage Americans were to disappear tomorrow, eventually I think a lot of those other things would disappear.
Yeah, for sure. I always say, if all the Tibetans were to be gone, then Tibetan culture, everything would go with it. And I think we all know that if whites ever were to be gone, then Western civilization will go with us. The thing I'm trying to put a focus on, though, is your specific experience and how you're able to shine a new light on things. Because being Hapa, you have an interesting kind of a racial leverage where you got one foot in both sides of the map, if you will, and it's a really unique thing. There's nobody in white identity politics with that unique leverage. So this is something I'm trying to pull out of you a little bit more, just to help the audience get to know you more on that level. There's many more levels to you, and they can see that when they get to your content, your YouTube channel. But can you speak to that at all?
About having leverage because I'm a Hapa?
Yeah.
That would be a first for me coming into this. I mean, because it's kind of weird because Hapas don't get, they're not white, but they don't get any of the benefits of being a POC. They're too white for it. Yeah. I'm not a person of color in a lot of cases.
Yeah.
So we don't even get the POC card. And it's really weird how a lot of Hapas will generally identify with their Asian side rather than their non-Asian side,
Interesting.
even if they're half white.
But But this is I'm sorry to interrupt, but this is exactly what I'm trying to get at with being in this oblivion, because what happens is, you'll have these assimilation. You could have then mixed marriages like this. You can have also people that are let's say 100% East Asian, but they've been here for generations. They cannot relate to the country that they came from originally anymore. But at the same time, they can't fully assimilate into the society that they're living in. So they're living in this limbo that doesn't exist. This is a reality, and this is exactly the point I wanted
Right.
to make. The Italians actually are a good example of this. You can take an Italian American that's been living here, the family's been living here for generations, or an Irish American that's been living here for generations. Their perception of being Italian or Irish is completely different than the perception of being Irish in Ireland. That's not to say it's worse or better, or it's just different, right?
Yeah.
And so the Irish person that grew up in, let's say, Boston, for example, goes back to Ireland, the Irish are always going to look at him as the American.
Sure.
He's just and so when you're halfway assimilated like that, that's what I mean by halfway assimilated. You're neither home, neither here nor there. And your identity is also kind of reflective of this kind of limbo. And when you have the racial component combined into this, in other words, it's already difficult from a cultural perspective. It's even more difficult from a racial perspective.
I would like to believe I'm an exception, and I think that I am to that. I mean, at least as far as my sensibilities are concerned, to some degree. But on the racial side of the equation, as I've stated, sensibilities are downstream from race, and it's something I've seen within my own family and like other Asian families and non-white families that have been here for many generations. It isn't just that they belong to a different race, but that their biospirit is at the root of their sensibilities, which leads to them supporting certain political causes, having certain beliefs. For example, and I mean, this is the example I keep coming to, the Second Amendment. It's strange to me that none of my Asian relatives support the Second Amendment. They just don't. Asian people are the least likely to be gun owners.
Right.
And I'm thinking, well, that's illogical because most of my Asian relatives right now, a lot of them are female, and they're not more than 100 pounds soaking wet. So wouldn't you want to be a gun owner? That would be logical, right?
Yeah.
But because of their genetic sensibilities, they support the establishment and the establishment's viewpoint on, Americans being disarmed and treated like, peons. Sorry, go ahead.
No, it just sounds to me that the sensibility of being pro-gun ownership is very perhaps individualist, sort of like
Exactly.
the rugged individualist, the cowboy spirit. That's.
It's also I think it's I'm not an expert, but I think it's like an Indo-European thing because the Indo-Europeans were a martial people.
Yeah.
And it goes back to our like Indo-European sensibilities that are with us somewhere in our hindbrain. I don't know. And there probably is a decline in Europe from south to north, meaning, the further north you go, for example, Europe is not known for having gun rights, but compared to other countries outside of America, they have more gun rights than, anywhere in like most of these Asian countries or, African countries, even the third world countries where civilians own guns are the exceptions are the countries that are like lawless and but as far as like countries that are not living in some sort of state of anarchy like Waziristan, there's a lot of legal gun ownership in Europe compared to other countries outside of the U.S. And it seems like the number of gun owners there's a higher percentage as you go further north. So it's more of a Northern European thing. It's more of an Indo-European thing. So there's a higher percentage of gun owners per capita in Germany than Italy, for example.
I might say that on the flip side, having been a guy that studied Asian culture for many years, that there's I find the Asian sensibility is to find your identity within the group. That, the idea of putting your last name first, Kent Donald, that I'm defined by my family rather than who's Donald. That's just that's nobody compared to the Kent family, and I have to represent the family and, save face, and that kind of grows out into the whole society. It seems to be, I hate to say it, but I think that kind of actually matches communism in some way. And although I'm profoundly
no,
anti-communist.
I would not say that. Hungarians
Well,
also have their last name first, by the way, just as a side note.
But Asians and Hungarians, I think, have radically different sensibilities. So I'm just pontificating. I can't measure that or prove that per se, but I wanted to get Hapa's perspective on that.
It's something that I've noticed with Asians, where they seem to be more like, I don't want to be too disparaging.
Certainly, I don't mean to be, by the way.
No, I don't want to say, no, not you. I know you're not trying to be, but especially myself, I don't want to, because I don't hate East Asian people or anything, and there are nice things about East Asian culture, and good for them. In Chinese people in China doing well and everything, but I just don't. I don't identify with their sensibilities. I don't identify with how they sort of mindlessly accept being under the thumb of a centralized authoritarian government. It goes against my own Anglo-Saxon sensibilities that I also have.
That's my point.
Yeah, but this is you see, this is an interesting position, because not all Europeans think this way, and a lot of Europeans are very communal. They're very much Germany is a very good example of this, but Central Europeans, for example, are very much communal, and also prone
There's a
to
genetic
being
basis for that within Europe. The Northwestern Europeans have the most Indo-European ancestry.
Oh, yeah.
Just saying, just putting that out there.
I will debate that with you, but that's okay. My position on this is a little different, because I think that the Central Europeans have a much different sensibility that's based purely on their history, on the things that they experienced, the invasions that came, the reason that they had to defend themselves, and the reason that they had to position themselves against the other. And that was not as profound as it was in Scandinavia or in the Anglo-Saxon world, which was more remote from foreign invasion.
True.
So I think that's probably more the reason behind that. And also, but also the Germans, the Central Europeans are a lot more collectivist than the Anglo-Saxons are. And there's a big divide in mentality on how this is defined. So, I mean, it's even within the European sphere, it's completely, opposite in many ways.
It's an interesting topic. There's a lot. I'd say that it's something that people in our sphere should probably go in deeper on, and to maybe even, kind of analyze every different group from the Slavs to the Celts and, on and on. But I guess focusing back on you again, Hapa, I'm trying to see what you bring to the topic of white identity politics. So, for example, you did a video on race mixing and your perspective on that. Maybe you could speak a little bit on that.
Well, yeah, I feel like I have to talk about it because I am mixed, and I'm happy to talk about it.
Sure.
Ever since the 2015 migrant crisis and what I saw, I started thinking about it more and more, because I started looking into the demographic numbers, and for the global white population, it's not looking good. The trick is defining white, though, and I would say this is probably going to be one of my next videos where I get into this topic, but I would say probably the world is less than 5 or 6% white, unmixed.
Okay.
And that's going down. And the issue is the diversity is, it seems like most of the world's diversity is going into white Western countries. So they're a minority of the global population, and they're getting the majority of the non-white diversity.
Right.
I'm sorry. What was your question again? You're asking me what do I bring to the table as a mixed race person, or what do I think of mixing?
Well, that's the general question, because I'm in a sense trying to feature your perspective on things.
Right.
But these unique, I mean, there's lots of specific questions regarding that. So, go ahead.
I'm trying to I bring that up because I'm trying to bring my opinion here into context, which is that as a mixed race person, I don't think it's right that white people should be a minority in anywhere in Europe or anywhere in North America.
Mm-hmm.
I think that they're a major branch off of the human tree.
Mm-hmm.
And, they should be like 30% of the world population instead of 6%.
Agreed.
I think that would be fair. I think that would be right. And, they're this is going to sound kind of supremacist, but I think that they're the most eugenic race. And if you care about the well-being of humans, you should care about eugenics. It's not BS. It's really important. And the world is going to suffer if we don't look at it through that lens. Mm-hmm. And that means everybody's going to suffer. So
it does open an interesting question, the idea that I guess whites as, how do I say this? It's very complex. So let me just lay it out a little bit first. So the idea of whites as being good for the earth, good for the world in some sense. And I mean, where I'm at personally is I'm in a sort of an isolationist state where I'm thinking we need to, close the borders, kick out people that don't want to assimilate, cannot assimilate, separate ourselves and allow ourselves to heal and grow again. The modern world is essentially created by Europe primarily. I mean, we put a robot on Mars, look at these kind of accomplishments. And we as a people, I don't really have to preach or whatever, go on and on about that. But the idea though of in some sense, whites having a kind of a purpose where we're useful or helping in some way in the world. And I'm not phrasing that very well, but in such a way as whereas, Africans want to stay in Africa and, Muslims want to stay in Muslim countries and et cetera, whereby, that would, I guess, is a sort of a nationalist view where everybody has their homeland and they don't bother each other. But go ahead, I'll let you continue your thought.
I think that's a pleasant way of looking at it, but I think it's a blessing that these people, a lot of them can't or don't want to assimilate, because you see the demographic peril that white people are facing worldwide, and it's really, I mean, a lot of these Western countries could easily be swamped or totally replaced. I was looking at one graph, the entire population of Northern Europe in one area is like 100 million people. They could be replaced twice by one country like Pakistan, just miscegenated out of existence easily. Right. You just open the floodgates. And, we saw the 2015 migrant crisis. It doesn't seem like to me that's really ended. Maybe it's died down a little bit. But that's probably going to continue until people start looking at politics through a racial lens.
Mm-hmm. And that's actually the answer. That's really the key. And that goes back to us earlier talking about everything is identity politics. Identity politics is king, per se,
Well, I don't like calling it that, but you're right. I agree. So what do I think about? I think race mixing, I wanted to get back to your original question. So I think race mixing is wrong in a general sense, but I say that as someone who's racially mixed, and yes, I like white women. Some people are not going to be happy about that. I don't think it's like the way to go about this is to like police people's personal lives, or that's never going to work. Or like we're all guilty of, I don't know, maybe I know I'm guilty of, I shouldn't say shaming some people online. Anonymously. But
well, you came up with a policy concept about
a policy concept. So I think that there needs to be policies that financially reward large white families, and anybody that wants access to white people would just, pay their taxes like everyone else. But, instead of their money going to Pakistan and Israel and Sudan and Ethiopia, it
Right.
goes to a large white family. Everybody otherwise, and you can do that. And then you can do that without having to take away people's political rights, or, try to control their private lives, having like secret police running around making sure that Hapa Perspective isn't dating a white girl. Face the wall. I think it's funny, but it like that's not a realistic solution. But a realistic solution, you could have just programs in place that kind of bleach the population by increasing the pool of unmixed white people.
So policy, essentially.
Yeah.
Now let's hear your thoughts on that.
Well, this is actually an excellent suggestion. I think the government of Hungary is doing something similar, where they're promoting they're introducing various policies, and now they put it in the auspices of family policy. But what they're really doing is they're trying to increase the birth rate of the native Hungarians, of the Hungarian population. And what they do is they, for example, if a mother has more than 3 children, then she doesn't have to pay taxes for the rest of her life. Then they have a policy where a young family, and I think they have it tied to age, I think that 35 is the limit, where the wife has to be 35. And if they have more than 3 children, then they get, I think, somewhere in the range of a certain amount of money that they get from the government to buy a home. And then they also get a certain amount of money. Again, I don't want to say exactly how much. It's I think $50,000, and then another $50,000 they get in loans, and very low interest rate loans, to buy a house and start a family. So I think that if you introduced policies that were pro-natal, and you tied it, and you do it in a way that it organically appeals to the majority population, in this case, for us, for our interests, the native white populations of Europe and the white populations throughout the world, then I think that would then help increase these demographics. But the biggest problem I see with the demographic issue is people not having a view of the future. Like, a lot of times you'll hear, "Oh, I don't want to raise a child in this crazy world," or "I don't want to have it." And I think that we have to work on the perception as well, giving hope to people, and trying to give a positive view of the future, that it's up to you, it's up to us to, create and to build our societies.
Beautifully said. That
it's going to be crazy if they don't have children, if they're white.
Right.
It'll be much crazier.
Yeah, and maybe even presenting the opposite through art, and through your work in your blog, presenting these alternatives that could happen in that world, might sort of shock people into realizing it and help them. Yeah, that's definitely true.
So one of the questions that I did have for you, Hapa, was, and it's in line with this theme here, is what are some ideas on helping to preserve Western culture, or white culture per se?
I wouldn't know. I mean, where would we start? Like right now, there's policy ideas. You guys talk a lot about art influencing people, memes, just talking to people. Exposure to diversity would probably win over. I mean, I was talking earlier about how a lot of people, I think, in the community, that there's a lot of people in the dissident right that think race is like biological materialism or something. And I'm pretty sure these people live in like rural Vermont or something. They don't know what it's like to be the one white guy in Baltimore or something,
Yeah. That's exactly my opinion as well. And I half joke about saying every white liberal should have to spend a week working in a school in a low-income neighborhood, and get their eyes opened about the realities of all that. But also there's this kind of weird,
sorry to cut you off. I think I wish you could. I wish this would work. You could also send them to a high income like Chinese neighborhood, and they realize, holy shit, these people are different. They're not
Yeah.
my people. You know,
Yeah.
because it shouldn't be. You know, I'm not coming at this as like an IQ nationalist or first worldist. Like I, I really see white people, even though I'm not white. I see white people as my people, and I think we have to be careful with how we sell these ideas because a lot of people unironically believe the I don't want to say like I don't want to call them normies, but there are a lot of people that are coming into the dissident right that they're only talking about the race issue because of like crime statistics. They just want to live in a safe neighborhood. They just want to grill, you know, or they just want people that are similar enough, assimilated enough. It's they don't see the bigger picture that you know you have your people and then there's other groups that are sensibility wise are aliens to your own sensibilities.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
It's about building community. You know, that's really, I'm sorry to interrupt. It's about building community. That's really what this is about. And you really want to form real life communities. And I think we need to really bring this message home by telling the audience, you know, everything that we do online is important. It's good. And I think that we are working on a lot of important topics. But the meat and potatoes is your real life community, the people that you're surrounded by, the people that you live with. Find people that think like you, find people that agree, and try to form communities. That's I think the biggest, most important message.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Well, the other thing I wanted to just real quick. I sorry to cut you off, man. Sorry. I just wanted to. I'm still back to what we were talking about earlier.
Go ahead. I apologize. Go ahead.
So as a Hapa, one of the big things I want to kind of get out there to people in our political sphere, and even I want to reach out to normies and civic nationalists and all that. You know, as someone that is half Chinese, I mean, you can see quite clearly that, you know, because again, I was saying that it's not just about crime statistics or wanting to live in a safe neighborhood or anything. Like you could live in, like Japan is a first world country, and a lot of Northeast Asian countries are physically nice places to live, especially if you're a white guy, right?
Sure, I've lived there actually.
Yeah, it's better to live there if you're a white guy than an Asian guy.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. That's true.
That's true. Yeah, you're smiling.
I'm not smiling about that.
No, all right. I'm giving you crap, but
you're like a rock star over there, actually.
Right? Yeah. Any of these countries, like they treat you like a king if you're a white guy. But the thing is that so on a surface level, even on a surface cultural level, East Asians can tick all of the boxes. I mean, there are places you can go to in Japan where on the surface, they've preserved French culture. And I mean, Japan is a safe place. North Korea, I'm not North Korea. South Korea is really safe. Maybe North Korea too. You know, North Korea is probably safer than a lot of places in America right now.
Oh, God. You're probably right.
Oh, I know I'm right.
Boy.
But so these Northeast Asians, you know, they can create a first world country. They can do first world neighborhoods. Mm-hmm. They can artificially preserve Western culture. Mm-hmm. And they're not necessarily low IQ people, but they're not your people. And that's really what I feel like it's interesting that I have to say this to a lot of white people as someone who's half East Asian. I have to explain this to them because they're still stuck on, a lot of them coming in are still stuck on crime statistics and they're just talking about preserving Western civilization on some surface superficial level. You know, they just want to live in a safe neighborhood and, you know, or a place where people like they want to live in a country where it's not like Brazil, where people are like running red lights and shooting at each other, right?
Right.
But it's more than that.
So the thing that I'm really sort of connecting with you on is this concept of what we call the white biospirit or the Western biospirit, and I think that in a sense is another word for sensibility. But here's the thing I'm struggling with. I've lived in Asia for 5 years. Blah blah blah, all that all the stuff that you know and I know, but the audience doesn't know, and that's this kind of this concept of sensibility that Asians stick together. They're their own kind of people. They have literally a different human filter, basically. Like that was one of my missions of moving to Asia, was to experience life through their eyes and through their sensibilities. Buddhism, Qigong, Kung Fu, language, travel, blah, 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 all the history, relationships. And it expanded my sense of what it is to be a human being tremendously. But the takeaway from it all was me recognizing, oh my God, I'm European, and what a great thing that is. And that's the whole issue with that ties in what we were saying before about whites not really knowing who they are in a way, and that, I think, contributes to the problems that we're having with replacement. So that's where I kind of say, we whites, to some extent, especially liberal whites, maybe should be the minority in some situation. And being a minority in Uganda as opposed to Japan, it'd be a very radically different experience.
Yeah, it's like, because I mean, what I often tell people is like, look, in a way, I'm glad that a lot of these migrants are the ones least likely to assimilate. Because otherwise,
it's crazy to think they should or would. I mean, that's such a foolish concept. It's the Constitution that brings us all together. That's insane.
Well, how goofy some like white boomers could be. I mean, if the majority of the migrants coming into the West were like rich Chinese people, they'd be like, well, oh, look at the incredible range of restaurants.
I think that just backs up my point about how whites
so
don't
nice, and they don't commit any crime. They're so docile,
and they're so pretty, and so
I personally, I don't understand what white guy. I mean, all right, I don't want to.
Well, that's another. I'm not going there.
Let's not go into that.
No.
I like white women. I do not like Asian women. But that maybe it's my sensibility.
This is a no waifu zone, so we're just gonna
no waifu zone. God bless them and everything. But go ahead, Nels. Something here to this, because it's really interesting. I'm really liking this conversation a lot, because it's bringing up a lot of difficult topics, actually. And the problem I see a lot of the time is that, at least, especially here in the United States, but also in Europe lately, in the last maybe 2 decades, that everything is defined by the outlier, not by so you're defining everything by the exception. You're not defining everything by the average. And what I mean by that, for example, is you'll say, oh, well, I know this guy, he's, mixed. This guy is from Uganda. This guy is from Vietnam. This guy's from here. Oh, they're really cool guys. They're nice guys. But that's an exception. That's not the rule. And so what people are doing is they're retreating into these outliers to use that as an exception to say, well, they don't want to have that scarlet R letter, burned onto their foreheads. And that's where it comes down to, like this stigma with being racist, like, oh, you're racist. And then everybody, coils, and then they like get all nervous and they say, well, yeah, but I got this buddy. And so we have to move away from this mentality, because it's destroying our demographics above everything else. But I would go so far as to be even more myopic. And I would say that I really don't care where anyone comes from. If they're not a part of my group, if they're not a part of my family, then I don't want to associate on an intimate level. And I want to have my community and my immediate community be a part of my family. And so for me, that's an important part. And so I would go so far as to say that, Europeans should first and foremost, be with their own nation. So a German should marry a German, a Hungarian should marry a Hungarian, a Frenchman should marry a French woman, so on and so forth, and that's number one. And then the exception should be if the German marries the Pole. That should be the exception. And that should be more an accepted exception. And now in the United States, it's a little bit more complicated, obviously. So it's not, you can't say that in the United States. But I would dare say that, even in the United States, you can say, hey, I want to marry somebody that's basically an American. And there's nothing wrong with that, because we define American as white. And that's the way we should be doing it. And that's the way we should be promoting the message, at least in my opinion.
It's hard to sell that message though, because there's so many, there's so many people that aren't white that think that they're white because they're citizens, or they served in the military. They wave the American flag. America, in the minds of a lot of normies, is still seen as a proposition nation, a magic dirt country.
Mm-hmm.
Magic Dirt. That's the name of our new band right there.
But you make a good point that it's in the United States, it's a lot more complicated than in other places, and I'll agree to that. Although this is also only after the 60s, because before the 60s, it was kind of implicitly understood, for the most part.
Right.
Sure. So this is also relatively new.
I think though that America proves something. It proves that race is a bigger deal, a bigger factor than ethnicity, because you had when most of the immigrants coming here were from Europe, when they were white Europeans. I think that, like, I know what I said about the Italians and the Irish being different, and that's true. There are ethnic differences within America between Germans and Poles and Anglo-Saxons, but at the same time, the melting pot experiment, as far as Europeans mixing with other Europeans, kind of worked, and it wasn't unprecedented, because Europe, you had the Visigoths roaming around, and if you go back far enough, everyone in Europe is from the same tribe too. So among other groups of white people, the melting pot thing does work, because they're all white. They're all of Indo-European extraction on some level. And America proves that you can have a country that just has a white identity. I mean, that sounds generic, but you understand what I mean. American originally meant Anglo-Saxon, but it did include some Germans and now Irish and Italian, and I think that that's fine.
Sure. So the first hour of the program, we really like to get to know the guest and let the audience get to know the guest, and then we turn the topic over to the discussion of the arts. And so before getting into Imperium Art specifically, I'd like to kind of just get your general sensibility towards the arts and culture, and what is art? What is the relationship between art and culture in general, from your view? Maybe a little difficult question.
Who are you asking me?
Of course.
So okay. What is my opinion of the relationship between art and people? Do I have the question?
Art and culture.
Art and culture.
Yeah. Go ahead.
I think
you have a different perspective on culture, so that kind of changes the question a bit, doesn't it?
Well, if culture is racial sensibilities, or downstream from racial sensibilities, then so too is art. And a lot of times art is conflated with culture. But of course you have modern art. Is that European culture? And that raises the question, what is culture?
Bingo.
And I think that this leads to more questions than answers. But I would say a lot of art is European, simply because Europeans are the most individualistic race and the most creative, and it's the product of European sensibilities. They dominate art in a lot of ways. Of course, you have art from other cultures, like ancient Chinese art, but as of today, when I say modern art, I don't mean Picasso in this.
You mean postmodern per se?
Postmodern, however you would define art, like animation on the internet or something. The whole concept of animation, the anything really, it's mostly the product of the Western mind initially.
Okay.
Of the white man.
Yeah, so art being objects of culture, you could say, because fashion, animation, video games, high art, low art, and pop art, it's a very broad term. But
video games would be a good thing to discuss, because that's something I'm very familiar with. As a guy.
Yeah, an expert too. Yeah, I know that you're pro gamer, so.
Yeah.
Okay. But let's pull it back a little bit, though. I think that White Art Collective, which we represent, would be very interested in, or learn something from this concept of redefining the arts from the perspective that culture is race, which I think is that what you're saying?
Well, yeah, in a sense, yes.
Okay. So because that takes our case in the White Art Collective and gives it more depth and breadth, perhaps, that I think we already know this in some instinctive way. That's kind of why we do what we do. And I certainly would never dare to represent everybody in the White Art Collective. They all have their unique perspectives, ideas, opinions, etc. But it's a relevant subject to what we are and what we do, and of course, Imperium Art. So it's just it's a neat new angle that I think is fresh. And having followed some of your content, following you on Telegram, etc., you have a lot of fresh ideas, and you may be a little modest or not able to show them all right here and now. But I do encourage people to follow you online. So, but let's pull it back then. So, what were your thoughts on the Imperium Art essay and or the documentary series on YouTube?
I don't think I saw the documentary on YouTube, but I did read the entire essay kind of last minute.
Mm.
And
Always honest, aren't you?
I had a lot going on, but I did read it. And
Okay.
I would say that
Wait a minute. How many beers have you had? Hold on.
not enough. So far, for the most part, I agree with it, but I just kind of feel like it's better. I don't feel like at the same time, I don't feel like I have an entire grasp on every. It seems like there were a lot of different ideas that Nolis was the author, I believe, was trying to touch on, and I think I'd understand them a lot better if we just kind of talked it out. But I like the idea. The general idea is like Imperium Art is sort of like this bridge for all of these different European cultures to connect. Am I right?
Yes.
Indeed. Yeah.
And that was the general gist of it. And it's like a critique of like modernism and, a lot of modern culture is, in my own words, commercialized and nihilistic. And I mean, those terms are thrown around a lot of those isms. And I feel like when you sort of like write an essay about this stuff, it kind of gets lost in the writing because people have kind of different connotations associated with these words.
So what do you think, okay, talking about the topic of culture is race, I'm trying to formulate some concepts and questions here. What should the direction of Imperium Art be if there's an art movement that is the expression of white identity politics, the expression of whites who are facing and expressing their experience of white replacement? What are some kind of parameters or central ideas that should exist within that?
I don't know. I think art movements kind of just happen organically. You can't really set parameters. It just kind of blossoms. I'm not familiar with like art movements, so I really don't have a good context to kind of articulate within. But I think that we're kind of seeing it already with like memes. There's so many memes, and I think memes are. I mean, maybe some people don't consider 4chan memes to be art, but I think that they're pretty damn effective.
Oh yeah, yeah. That's an interesting concept. So just a little art history here. So many art movements, yes, they do happen organically, and they oftentimes rebel against the movement that came before. It's sort of the younger generation comes up through the academy and says, why can't we do this? Or we're restricted by these rules, so therefore we're going to throw off the chains of tradition and evolve into now we're doing this next topic. So it's, in general, the history of art in Europe and the West, you could say, has evolved up until a certain time where you had, maybe surrealism is the beginning of it, but certainly abstract expressionism is the end of it. It's the deconstruction of that. And postmodernism, I can argue that it's not art in some ways, but there is some art to it. But the question kind of comes back to, if we are involved in this discussion about white identity politics, and we're thinking about policy, and we're responding to current events, etc., it seems to me that we really ought to have an idea about, well, how do we harness the arts for these purposes? And that's generally the discussion in Imperium Art, in this documentary series. So not everybody that we have on the show has an arts background, but that we like that in general because it kind of brings a fresh point of view. So I don't know, I just wanted to try to get more of your thoughts on it. You're talking about memes as a kind of art. Would you say memes are like a pop art, or I mean, could memes ever become a high art? Because I see it as just sort of a, I don't want to call it low art, but it's maybe the three of us should kind of figure that out. What do you think, Nellis? Let's get your input on this.
Yeah, I would say that the primary goal is always looking at the overarching theme that binds us together, finding those threads of commonality that brings us closer together. So you, and maybe this is also an interesting point, that the European people are probably one of the most diverse group of people in terms of language, culture, traditions, and things like that, religion as well. So we have to look at all these different aspects and find those threads that bind us together, bring us closer, and create that overarching theme of awareness. But also, you know, it's an important point to highlight the importance of the underlying cultures and nations. So it's a delicate balance, I think. But primarily that, I think, I would say that's the goal of the Imperium Art project, among, I'd say, maybe first and foremost.
What do you think, Hapa?
Sounds great. Bring all the different, yeah. But I don't think I don't know how you would go about, like, you know, having a, like, it all feels very structured, I guess, and that's kind of what I think is kind of, I'm not against having a structured approach, but I think that these things are kind of already happening.
Okay.
And it doesn't need to be under a banner or like a structural sort of, you know, organized approach. It's already happening. It's happening with memes and people on Instagram, you know, these people from different European nations coming together and finding out what they have in common. And, you know, they're building new bridges because of the state of the world right now.
You know what? Maybe the way to put this is to provide a context for this organic realization, so that it does not that it's not poisoned by parasitic elements. Maybe that would be a good way to do that.
Right. Yeah. What is that? I mean, it's. I think the context has to be, obviously, you know, understanding white replacement, understanding all the facts, you know, who's behind globalism, what their methods are, what the faults are of whites, that they can't seem to see this, or they can't seem to embrace it, breaking the narrative of white supremacy, breaking the narrative of demonizing whites, blah, 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 all that garbage that whites are generally brainwashed with. So that could perhaps be something in a manifesto, is, you know, that your work in some way should dissolve this brainwashing and allow people to go free, have no white guilt, these concepts. But then even further, to maybe even be able to identify the sensibilities of white art, white positive art, as we call it. So, you know, when you listen to, I don't know, say, you know, a Beethoven concerto, and you compare it to Stravinsky, you know, you could say, wow, these are different sensibilities towards music, right? So what are the sensibilities of white art, you know, or white positive art? So that would be creating almost like a list of aesthetics that we could use as a guide to critique white positive art. And I think this is, so like this concept of sensibilities, which you've introduced, is a really nice jump off point to kind of refresh our view on the arts and what we're doing with Imperium Art. Does this make sense?
Yeah, it makes sense. It sort of sounds like to me you want, and I'm not against this at all, but it sounds like you kind of want to sort of like start catalyzing this stuff. It feels academic, and there's nothing really, like, that's not a bad thing at all. But I just I guess I still feel kind of lost at the same time of what your goals are with the Imperium Art.
Well, you stated it actually very well, that it's academic in the sense that when you're documenting the arts that are happening, you're doing it from an objective perspective. Now, I'm both, Nullis and I are within the movement, but the Imperium Art project and these videos, etc., are an objective academic look back into it. And that's why we invite artists on the show to give their perspectives, as well as people like yourself, content developers, philosophers, people who understand the politics and that side of what's happening, because they're clearly, obviously, totally entwined. So I think maybe what you're feeling is a hesitation towards, like, don't make it too formalized, like, don't make these are the hard rules of white positive art. And we're certainly not doing that. But at the same time, it can't be nebulous. And I think that any art movement has to have a name, and it has to have some academic writings or documentation about it to discuss it. So it's half and half. I'd say, like, 1 foot, we have on these kind of structural concepts about critique, aesthetics, history, and then on the other hand, it's, well, let's meet all these different artists and see what they do. What's their unique perspective? What are they bringing to the vast array of white art? It's quite different from any other movement. Like, Impressionism has its rules, Dada has its rules, blah, 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 Romanticism, they all have rules. This doesn't have rules per se, other than just to, well, I will let Nullis take it from here, because his essay is quite thorough and he's very well spoken on the topic. Go ahead, Nullis.
So the first point is that if we can circle back to the beginning of this conversation, where Hapa, you mentioned the migrant crisis of 2015, and what you witnessed there were quite a bit of people in our own, basically our own brothers and sisters who are completely clueless and in a way self-destructive without even realizing it, or in some sad instances, tragic instances, almost deliberately self-destructive. And this is an ailment in our current society right now. And so when we talk about art, yes, there are organic representations of it through the memes, through the various forms. Excuse me, I'm gonna have to cough for a minute. Excuse me. So we have all these different organic representations of it. But we have to be cognizant of the destructive elements. We have to understand that the enemy is working very hard to deconstruct any attempt that we have at forming any kind of organic unity. So we have to create a context. We have to create a platform, if you will, where we can then provide an understanding of what it is that we're trying to achieve in the broader sense, and beyond the organic, beyond the meme, so to speak. So what we're saying is that there's a bigger struggle here, and there's a bigger issue here that we have to face. And sadly, a lot of times, our own brothers and sisters are our worst enemies in many ways. And I mean this in a very sad sense. I mean, I'm not, celebrating it by any means. I mean, it's just tragic. And so we're forced to then provide some kind of messaging, not only to those who are already working on it, but also to those who maybe we can give them something who are lost, who don't understand what's going on around them, because there's a lot of people that are completely clueless, and but they feel instinctively that something is not right here. And so that's what we're trying to really do with this whole Imperium Art project, is just to provide the contextualization, understanding, and also a self-confidence in who we are beyond, our incorporating our nations, but beyond our nations. And so making us a stronger whole through our collective arts and culture. That was a little academic, wasn't it?
That I like the way you put that, and I like what you're doing, and I'm totally on board, in agreement. I think maybe a great way for me to think about it, or one way to think about it, is you want to define and contextualize what your people are doing before your enemy does.
Exactly. And I think that that's an important part, but we also have to identify what the enemy has done and how we got here. So there's a an element here of self-reflection that we have to take, that we allowed this to happen. But we also have to understand that there are elements that have been hard at work trying to take our continuity and sever it in various places throughout history. So we have to be aware of all these things. And maybe our job is just to provide that framework, and then just leave it out there for the audience, for the rest, for our family, basically, to understand and work with.
So this is a little thing I want to jump in on. You were talking about, taking over the narrative before the enemy does. Just today on Twitter, I saw at the Museum of Modern Art Twitter page, they have a film documentary about the origins of the Pepe meme, and how it's a documentary movie out there about the guy who created that frog cartoon, and how the alt-right co-opted it for our enjoyment and expression, and et cetera, et cetera. So as you can tell, that such a documentary would frame the alt-right as like the evil Nazis and the racists and yada yada. And this is being shown at the Museum of Modern Art in Manhattan, which I used to visit frequently when I lived in New York. But I thought to myself, hey, here's a great opportunity. I'll reach out to them and say, hey, you're promoting this film, people to come and see it at the museum. Well, why don't you contact me and check out the Imperium Art show on YouTube, where you can actually see the arts of the alt-right. And, of course, I haven't heard back from them, right? So, I mean, the door is always open. I would love it if, Imperium Art and the White Art Collective could get the proper attention that it deserves from established art, organizations like that. I doubt that'll ever happen. I think that just brings up another topic which has come up many times on the show, which is just simply that we have to create our own art industry or art education structure, etc. So it's an interesting topic. Is there anything you want to conclude on? I'm really, really happy to have you on the show. Hapa?
I think it's great that you guys are trying to control the frame. I think that's one way to look at it. I think that's the word that Nellis used, because it really does seem like any content that our people produced is, if it ultimately, the frame of it, the contextualization, the understanding, analysis, whatever, falls into the hands of the establishment, the globo homo, whatever. And like you were talking about, they're having an art exhibit, and they're talking about how Pepe was co-opted by the alt-right, and we have to sort of, it's a race for contextualization, or
maybe we should
framing these things.
We should perhaps be co-opting a lot more,
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. So that's the answer I was kind of looking for, was like, what can we together, what concepts can we come up with? And
we have to define ourselves before they try to define us.
Precisely. And the arts, I think, are a great way to do that.
because whoever controls the frame controls the entire narrative. And they do
Yes.
that. They not only do that with language, like, you know, with fake words like racist, but they're also doing it with art. And you see this with movies, how they depict,
Yes.
how they misrepresent people with our political views and our entire history, and yeah, so on and so forth. So hopefully, I think I understand what you guys are trying to do with Imperium Art now.
You nailed it. Yeah.
Okay.
He who controls the spice controls the universe. There you go.
Oh boy.
That's a little shout out to Hyreth right there.
Yes, I knew you were gonna.
No, I'm not simping. Nullis. Okay.
I didn't say that.
Nullis and I are the SS, the simping. What was the joke about the SS?
The secret simps.
Secret simps.
Oh God.
It's just one of our jokes.
No.
It's just
that's Donald though. I stand.
Oh yeah, right. So, you got to have a laugh too. Things are so serious, that it's good to have some fun and camaraderie.
Yes.
But yeah, Hapa,
There
thank
needs
you
to
so
be an
much.
Imperium comedy collective.
Oh my God, yes. I've often thought comedy is probably the hardest thing to do of all. I don't know if I would call comedy art, but it is performance, and there is something literary to it per se, if you're writing jokes and these kind of things. But yeah, that would be a lot of fun. We'll look into that. Who would you suggest? Yeah, who could be on an Imperium comedy show?
Well, we should get Sam Hyde on our show.
Yeah.
So this is a shout out. I don't know if he ever listens to the show, but if he does, we'd love to have you.
Sam Hyde, you're next. We're coming for you. All right. Well, Hapa, thanks again so much for joining us and sharing your perspectives.
Thank you.
You notice what I did there? Anyway, okay.
Oh boy.
I know. I had too many beers before the show. That's why. But anyway, bless you. Thank you so much. And ladies and gentlemen, please follow Hapa Perspective. The links will be below. And thank you, Nullis, so much for sharing your perspectives as well and getting into the mix. You guys have a good one. We'll see you next time.